There was a time when this company owned your weekends. $6 billion in revenue, nearly 9,000 stores, 65 million customers, a blue and yellow sign glowing on every street corner in America, and a phrase burned into an entire generation's memory: make it a Blockbuster night. It was untouchable, it was everywhere. And then, in a single conference room in Dallas, its CEO made what people would come to call the dumbest decision in the history of business. In the year 2000, 3 men flew across the country to offer him their company. It was small, it was losing money. They wanted $50 million for it, and he laughed them out of the room. That little company was Netflix. 10 years later, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, and today only a single store is left standing on the entire planet. But here's the thing almost nobody tells you. The man who said no wasn't a fool. He was a retail genius who nearly saved Blockbuster not once, but twice. The company wasn't killed by Netflix, it was killed from the inside, by a boardroom knife fight over a bonus, by an addiction to punishing its own customers, and by one of the pettiest feuds in corporate history, a feud so bitter it ended with a kitchen sink arriving in the mail. So the real question isn't, how could they be so stupid? It's something much darker. How do you destroy a $6 billion empire when you're doing everything you were trained to do right? Let me take you back to the beginning. Blockbuster didn't start with movies, it started with oil. In the early 1980s, a Texas software developer named David Cook was writing database programs for oil and gas companies. Dry, technical work, keeping track of inventory for the petroleum industry. He was good at it. He understood, better than almost anyone at the time, how to use computers to track thousands of items moving in and out of a warehouse. And then the oil market collapsed, his customers stopped paying their bills, and David Cook suddenly needed a new way to make a living. His wife, Sandy, had an idea. Why not video rental? In the mid-80s, renting a movie was booming, but the stores themselves were a mess. They were tiny, cramped, often a little seedy, run by mom-and-pop owners with a few hundred tapes crammed behind a counter. If you wanted a specific movie, good luck. Cook looked at that chaos and saw something nobody else did: a data problem. And data problems were exactly what he knew how to solve. So on October 19, 1985, in Dallas, Texas, he opened the very first Blockbuster video. And it was unlike anything anyone had seen. While the competition stocked a few hundred titles, Cook's store opened with over 8,000 tapes lined up on bright, clean, well-lit shelves. Every single one was tracked with a barcode and a computerized checkout system, revolutionary for a video store in 1985. He even studied the neighborhood around each location and stocked it to match the local taste. It was a rental store built like a piece of software. The response was insane. On opening night, so many people flooded through the doors that the staff physically had to lock them, not to close up, but to stop even more customers from pouring in. Cook had struck a nerve. He'd turned the humble video store into a destination. But here's the problem with striking a nerve that big. Growth costs money. To build the empire he was imagining, Cook needed capital, and fast. Far more than a former oil software guy from Texas had lying around. And the man who would step in to fund it, the man who would turn one lucky store into a global juggernaut, was a billionaire who, by his own admission, didn't even own a VCR. His name was Wayne Huizenga, and he was not a movie man. He was a garbage man, quite literally. Huizenga had built waste management into the largest trash hauling company in America, starting from a single truck. He knew nothing about films and cared even less. When his partners first pitched him on investing in Blockbuster, his response was essentially, "I don't own a VCR." But Huizenga knew one thing better than almost anyone alive: how to take a business and multiply it ruthlessly at scale. In 1987, he bought in, and David Cook soon left the company he'd founded. What happened next was one of the most aggressive expansions corporate America had ever witnessed. Huizenga didn't just open stores, he devoured competitors, buying up rival chains and converting them, flooding the country in blue and yellow. At the peak of that expansion, Blockbuster was opening a brand new store somewhere in the world roughly every 17 hours. Let that sink in. Not every month, not every week, every 17 hours. By 1994, Blockbuster was so dominant that media giant Viacom swallowed it whole in a deal valued at around $8.5 billion. The blue and yellow logo had gone from a single Dallas storefront to a genuine cultural icon in less than a decade. Renting a movie and making it a Blockbuster night weren't just activities anymore. They were rituals. On the surface, this was one of the great American success stories. But underneath that success was a secret. A rotten, ticking secret that would eventually bring the whole empire crashing down. Because Blockbuster's profits didn't just come from renting you movies. A massive slice of its money came from punishing you. Late fees, those infamous rage-inducing late fees you got hit with when you forgot to rewind or returned Terminator 2 a day late. At their peak, late fees pulled in around $800 million a year, roughly 1 out of every $6 the company made. Think about what that really means. Blockbuster's business model was quietly, structurally dependent on its own customers screwing up. The company made a fortune every time you failed. It was the golden goose and the Achilles heel, the same thing. And somewhere out in California, one furious customer had just been slapped with a $40 late fee for a movie about a doomed space mission, and he was about to turn that anger into a weapon aimed straight at Blockbuster's heart. The story goes like this. A software entrepreneur named Reed Hastings rented a copy of Apollo 13 from his local Blockbuster, forgot to return it, and buried the tape somewhere under a pile of papers. 6 weeks later, he found it, along with a $40 late fee. He was embarrassed. He was angry. He didn't even want to tell his wife. And on the drive to the gym, so the legend goes, he had his lightning bolt moment. What if a video store worked like a gym membership? Pay one flat monthly fee, use it as much or as little as you want, and never ever get punished for being late. That idea became Netflix. It's a beautiful story. It's the kind of origin myth Silicon Valley loves. There's just one problem. It's not really true. Netflix co-founder Mark Randolph, the other man in the room, later admitted the Apollo 13 tale was, in his words, a convenient fiction. A story they polished up because it explained the business so cleanly. In fact, when Blockbuster went digging through its own records, it couldn't even find the rental, and reportedly asked Hastings to stop telling the story altogether. The real birth of Netflix was messier and less romantic. Hastings and Randolph just knew they wanted to build the Amazon of something, and mailing DVDs happened to be the idea that worked. But myth or not, the threat was very real. Because by the late 90s, these two worlds, the giant with 9,000 stores and the tiny startup mailing discs in envelopes, were on a collision course, and in the year 2000 they finally ended up in the same room staring across the same table. What happened next would decide the fate of both companies, because the men about to make the biggest decision of their lives had no idea what was coming. Picture the scene. Early 2000, 3 men from Netflix, Reed Hastings, Mark Randolph, and their finance chief, walk into Blockbuster's towering headquarters in Dallas. They're nervous. They're broke. Netflix has fewer than 300,000 subscribers, and it's bleeding tens of millions of dollars a year. Across the table sits John Antioco, the CEO of a $6 billion colossus, a man widely regarded as one of the sharpest retail operators in the country. The Netflix guys make their pitch. Buy us. Let us become your online arm. We'll run Blockbuster.com. You keep dominating the stores. Together, we own the future. And then comes the number, $50 million. By most accounts, Antioco and his team just about laughed them out of the building. And you have to understand, in that moment, it wasn't insane. On one side of the table, 9,000 stores, 65 million customers, a brand every American knew by heart. On the other, a money-losing.com with a few 100,000 subscribers, in the middle of a bursting tech bubble, asking for $50 million. If you were sitting in Antioco's chair, with everything you knew in the year 2000, you might have laughed too. That's the trap. The decision that looks moronic in hindsight looked perfectly reasonable at the time. And that's exactly what makes this story a tragedy instead of a joke. But this wasn't even the first lifeline Blockbuster let slip. A couple of years earlier, a Warner Brothers executive named Warren Lieberfarb had come to them with a deal that could have protected their entire kingdom. DVDs were brand new, and Lieberfarb proposed a special rental window, a period where new movies would be available to rent at Blockbuster before they could be bought on disc in stores, with the studios taking a 40% cut of the rental money. Blockbuster, which at the time earned nearly half the studio's rental income on new releases, didn't seize it. And so instead, cheap DVDs went straight onto shelves at retailers like Walmart, where you could just buy the movie for a few bucks, quietly eroding the whole reason to rent in the first place. So Blockbuster was slow. But here's what makes Antioco a fascinating figure instead of a punchline. Eventually, he got it. He saw the danger, and he moved. He made a bold, expensive, genuinely visionary bet. He killed the late fees, the golden goose, the $800 million addiction, because he understood customers hated them, and Netflix was winning on exactly that point. He poured enormous sums into building Blockbuster Online, and he launched something called Total Access, a killer feature Netflix simply could not match. Rent a movie online, then return it to a physical store and walk out with another one, free. And it worked. Blockbuster Online rocketed to 2 million subscribers. It was closing the gap. For the first time, Netflix was genuinely scared. In fact, things got personal. On a call with Wall Street analysts, Reed Hastings complained that Blockbuster had thrown everything but the kitchen sink at Netflix. So John Antioco, never one to miss a jab, packed up an actual kitchen sink and mailed it to Hastings. That's how close this fight was. Blockbuster wasn't a dinosaur lying down to die. It was a giant that had finally woken up, and it was landing real punches. Antioco's strategy might have actually worked. And that is when Blockbuster reached up and strangled itself. Enter the villain of the final act, Carl Icahn, a legendary Wall Street corporate raider, an activist investor with a nose for blood. Icahn bought up a huge stake in Blockbuster and was horrified by what he saw. Antioco was burning hundreds of millions on the online business. He'd thrown away the lucrative late fees. To Icahn, this looked like a CEO torching the company's profits. He wanted cost-cutting, he wanted the cash. And in 2005, after a brutal proxy war, he won seats on the board and began fighting Antioco for control of the company's very soul. And then the whole thing came down to something almost unbelievably petty: a bonus. After a strong year in 2006, John Antioco was owed an annual bonus of more than $7.5 million. Icahn thought it was outrageous. The two men dug in. What should have been a footnote exploded into all-out war, and in 2007, over that bonus, John Antioco walked out the door. The one executive who actually understood the threat, who was actually building the future, was gone over a paycheck. His replacement was a man named Jim Keyes, the former CEO of 7-Eleven, and Keyes did the exact opposite of everything Antioco had bet on. He slashed the online budget. He refocused the company on its physical stores. He even brought back the hated late fees. And in case you're wondering whether he understood the danger bearing down on him, here are his own words. He said he was confused by this fascination that everybody has with Netflix. Confused. As Netflix prepared to launch streaming and change the world forever, the new captain of Blockbuster was confused about why anyone cared. From there, the ending writes itself. Blockbuster was already staggering under roughly $1 billion in debt, much of it loaded on during its split from Viacom. Then, in 2008, the global financial crisis hit, the worst possible moment to be a heavily indebted company betting on shopping malls. The online strategy was dead. The stores were emptying, and in 2010, the empire that once opened a store every 17 hours filed for bankruptcy. So who really killed Blockbuster? It's tempting to say Netflix. It's tempting to say Antioco and that $50 million laugh. But look closely at what actually happened, and a stranger truth comes into focus. Netflix didn't kill Blockbuster. Blockbuster killed Blockbuster. The company was so addicted to its own late fees, so ruled by short-term profits and a boardroom that couldn't see past the next quarter, that when one leader finally tried to do the brave, necessary, painful thing, it forced him out over a bonus and undid all his work. The machine was built for efficiency, not survival, and the very discipline that made Blockbuster great made it impossible to change. John Antioco wasn't the villain of this story, and he wasn't the fool either. He was something closer to a tragic figure, a man who saw the future, reached for it, and got dragged back down by the empire he was trying to save. And he knew it, because here's the final twist, the detail that says everything. After he left Blockbuster, John Antioco quietly sold his shares in the company, and used the money to buy stock in Netflix. The man who supposedly laughed Netflix out of the room bet his own fortune on it. He understood exactly what was coming. He just couldn't make Blockbuster understand in time. Today, there is one Blockbuster store left in the entire world. It sits in Bend, Oregon, a strange, beautiful little time capsule that people now visit like a museum, and that was once even rented out on Airbnb as a 90s-themed sleepover. Meanwhile, the tiny company they wouldn't pay $50 million for is now worth around $300 billion. That is the price of comfort. That is what it costs to laugh at the thing that's coming to replace you. But Blockbuster isn't the only giant that stared its own executioner in the face and didn't blink. Because there's another company, one you've definitely heard of, that didn't just ignore the future. It actually invented the technology that would destroy it, and then buried it in a drawer, terrified of what it might do. If you think Blockbuster's mistake was bad, wait until you see this one. Just click the thumbnail on screen now and I'll see you there in a second.